Okay, so adding integers, chapter 1, lesson 5. All right, remember opposites when you add a number and its opposite together, like 6 plus -6, you should always get 0. So that's a special property of opposites. When you add two opposites together, you always get 0. This means that they have an alternative name. They have a name called additive inverses. And what that is a really fancy way of saying you're adding them, okay, and they inverse each other. It's kind of like saying, like, if you drove 20 miles to the, Walmart, and then you returned 20 miles, you're right back where you started. Okay, you're at 0, nil. Okay. Using variables, since we're getting into algebra thinking, if I have x, which can represent any number in the whole wide world, and I add it with the opposite of x, it has to equal 0. And vice versa. If I have a negative x, and I add it with the opposite of negative x, it also has to equal 0. Now, to add integers, one way we can represent this is using tiles. I'm going to say that one of these little blue boxes represents a positive 1, and one of these little red boxes represents a negative 1. When I have a little positive 1 plus a little negative 1, it has to equal 0 because they're opposites. They're additive inverses. We call this a zero pair. One little blue one and one little red one together cancel out. They kind of undo each other. So they call them a zero pair. When they're paired up, make 0. So we can use this to help us solve some examples. All right, so example 1. Let's say we have 2 plus -5. Okay, you can see that I have my 2 blue tiles plus my 5 negative red tiles. Remember, each one represents of either a positive 1 or a negative 1. So I'm basically combining them together. I'm adding. That's what adding means. Well, when I do that, you notice that there's some 0 pairs that form. They kind of pair up. So the blue one, you can think of it as one blue one smashes into one red one and they're annihilated. Another blue one smashes into another red one and they're annihilated. Well, now once those are gone, the 0 pairs you could think of it as they disappear or they magically explode or something like that. You're left with 3 negative red tiles. That means that the answer is -3. That's what you're left with. Now, getting away from the tiles for a moment, you can also use a number line to represent integer addition. So say we have -8 plus 3. What this means is we're starting at -8, and we want to move 3 to the right because 3 is a positive number. Now, if we were adding a -3, you would move to the left because that's what negative numbers do. So we start at -8, and we move 1, 2, 3 to the right. And wherever you land on the number line is your answer. We landed on -5. So -8 plus 3 is -5. Now continuing on. Now here is the way, though, that you're really going to want to remember it. Tiles are nice. Okay, the number lines are nice. But what are you going to do when you have something like 44 plus -127? I'm not going to draw those tiles. So it's helpful to remember the addition integer rules. All right, so there's 2 cases here. In case 1, both the integers can have the same sign. So for example, like you've been doing for a long time, a positive plus a positive is always a positive. So like a +3 plus a +7 is +10. You've been doing this for a really long time. A negative plus a negative is equal to a negative. So this seems kind of weird, but it's not too bad. A -5 plus a -2 is a -7. You notice what I did is I just found the sum. I kind of thought, okay, well that's just 5 plus 2, 7. But since that's negative and that's negative, it's got to be a -7. A negative plus a negative is a negative. The way a lot of students like to remember this first part of the rule is same sign sum. If it has the same sign, you just add them together. Sum means the result of addition. So you just add them and keep the sign. But if they have different signs, if the 2 integers have different signs, the steps are a little bit different here. What you want to do first is find the difference. You should be thinking subtraction. Find the difference in their absolute values. Then the answer will have the same sign as the integer with the greater absolute value. It's a lot of vocabulary words, but let's walk through an example. Say I had 13 plus negative 7s. These have different signs. One's positive, one is negative. Okay. So let's take the absolute value of both of them. The absolute value of 13 is 13. The absolute value of negative 17 is 17. The difference between 17 and 13 is 4, or 17 minus 13. That's 4. Now our answer has to have the same sign as the absolute value that was larger. So negative 17 had a larger absolute value, so the sign is negative. Notice how 17 is larger than 13. So our sign matches that integer that had the larger absolute value. So it has to be negative 4 as our answer. Let's do another example to illustrate this, but we're going to add a little bit more to it. So let's take a look at example 3. I want to simplify negative 7 plus negative 4 plus 13 plus negative 5. A lot going on there. Now remember, with order of operations, we always want to move left to right. So we're going to start with negative 7 plus negative 4, since I don't see any grouping or addition or multiplication or division, any of that stuff. So negative 7 plus negative 4. Those two integers have the same sign. So I just kind of add them together and keep the sign. So negative 11. Now we're doing negative 11 plus 13. These two integers have different signs. So think for a moment. Okay, the absolute value of negative 11 is 11. The absolute value of 13 is 13. The difference between 11 and 13 is 2. Okay. Now 13 has a larger absolute value. So it's a positive 2 because it has to match that sign. Moving on from here. 2 plus negative 5. These two integers have different signs. So therefore, okay, absolute value of 2 is 2. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. Okay. The difference between 2 and 5 is 3. So the integer with the larger absolute value is negative 5. So that 3 should be a negative 3 because it matches the sign. All right, I'm Mr. Bajorka, and this was adding integers.